Hey Dev, nice to see you again. I hope you're ready for our new project. Today we're going to build a budget tracker app. We'll learn about Spring Boot, how to set up a local testing database using H2 and Hibernate, and we're going to create a fancy front end with React. As usual, you can find the source code link in the description and you can check it out. I hope you're as excited as I am, so let's get started. As usual, since this is my first video about Spring Boot, I want to explain what it is. So Java is the main language we are going to use to create our application, but it doesn't include built-in tools for building web apps. That's why we need external help, and this is where the Spring framework comes in. Spring is built on top of Java and provides a lot of powerful features such as dependency injection, controllers, database access, and much more. However, Spring on its own isn't always simple to configure. And that's why we're going to use Spring Boot. Spring Boot is an extension of Spring that makes our life even easier. It simplifies configuration, reduces boilerplate, and helps us to set up projects much faster. This is why we're choosing this framework for our project, just because it's offers easier configuration and a smoother project setup. Again, in the production, very often you're going to use Spring Boot. So now that everything is clear, we can move on to the development. Prerequisites. To make sure we're on the same page, I want to share what SDK and builders I have installed. So I'm going to use Java 21. You can find it on the official website. I'm going to drop the link in the description. And I'm going to use a Maven building system, Apache Maven 3.911 version. Again, you can get it on the official website. This link in the description. So Spring Boot can help us to generate initial code with all tools and dependencies included. This is how it looks like. I'm going to select project with Maven, language Java, Spring Boot version 3.57, and project metadata. I'm going to give it name.com Budgetify, artifact Budgetify, name, the same, description, expense tracker, package name, com.budgetify. So packaging will be jar, Java's already mentioned 21st, and let's add dependencies. We just need 4 dependencies. Spring Data GPA, Spring Web, basically for building our web application. GPA is for our SQL and Hibernate, so just want to use ORM. And H2 database, it's like for testing, right? And Lombok, going to generate our getter settings and our empty and all argument constructor. So I extracted the zip file generated by the Spring Boot initializer and opened the project in IntelliJ. Let's take a look at how it's structured. So we have our source main folder and our entry point and all the dependencies defined. Well, time to build. So let's talk about what we want to build. Our goal is to create the Budgetify application, which will allow us to view, add, remove, and update expenses and income. That's our very simplified version. So we're going to start with building models. So we need to represent our data. So we have to create entities that will do that. For expenses, we'll store the name, amount, category, and date of the expense. We will do something similar for income. And this is exactly what we're going to use our models for. So let's create a new package. You can think about it, folder called models. Inside it, I'm going to create 2 files, expense.java and income.java. Inside our expense Java, I'm going to define our name, category, and etc. All these fields that we decided. So let's start with the first one, ID. So I'm going to create private integer ID. It's going to represent our primary key, basically the main unique feature to get our database records, right? So next it will be name. It's going to be string. Next one will be double amount. Double, remember, it's a data type. Category will be string, and our date is going to be a date data type. So also I'm going to create public expense constructor. It will be just empty. For all arguments, we're going to use Lombok annotation a little bit later. So above our public expense class, I'm going to type a few things. It's going to be an annotation entity. Basically, it's just going to tell our Spring Boot GPA, treat it as a model, right? We're going to define table annotation. We're going to give it name expense. This is how we map our database table with our model. Next, it will be data. Again, it's a part of a Lombok package, and basically we'll just tell it to generate getters and setters for us. And the last one will be all arguments constructor. Again, auto generation. Also, I want to add generated value to our ID. So basically, I don't need to manually add ID every time I insert a new record. So generated value strategy equals generation type identity. Also going to update this checker persistence. Just we need ID. We already imported everything, so perfect. Looks good. So now let's do the same for our income.java file. So basically we're going to copy and paste our expense Java and add minor tweaks. So first of all, our table from expenses will change to income, right? Because it will be completely different table that will only have records for our income data, right? All our properties will stay the same, and I'm just going to change public expense to public income. Everything else looks good. So our next step will be implementing controllers. If you don't know what controllers are, so they're essential part of our API. This is where we define our routes so that users can call them to perform certain actions such as create, delete, update, and so on. So basically, this is how we tell our service to process requests depending on HTTP method and route. We're going to create a new folder / package in our app and name it controllers. So it should look like this. So inside, we're going to create a new file named expensecontroller.java. The code inside should have everything related to expense only. So one controller, one model, right? Okay. So first of all, I wanna add annotation REST controller and annotation request mapping, where I define our route. So it will be expenses. So this REST controller and request mapping annotation is just going to tell our application that this is the file is used as a controller. And expenses request mapping, this is how we're going to access our action methods, having a route. For example, if you go to localhost 8080/expenses and your endpoint name, you might see the data that was sent back to you. Inside our expense controller, I want to define a variable called expense service. You don't have to worry about this yet, right? But basically this will be a variable that is going to be a reference for our service, and service, it will be additional layer that will be responsible for business logic. So for example, imagine if you think about like our model, like validation, input validation, or different things like data transformations will go into X service. Don't worry about this now. We just define a variable, and we're going to use our constructor expense controller for injecting it. So our Spring Boot will do dependency injection for us. So now let's define our routes. Again, I was talking about HTTP verbs, get, post, delete, put, and all that, right? So our Spring Boot define our annotations for us. So our first annotation will be get mapping. Obviously, it's annotation for get action. So we're going to say public list expense, get expense list. So when user will go to localhost expense 8080, like expenses or whatever the port is, they will see a list of our expenses, right? So we're just going to say return expense service dot get all expenses. Again, we did not write our service yet. Just imagine it's there. We're going to work on this later. So our next route will be post mapping. We're going to add additional endpoint / add expense. That will be our route. And we're going to define public expense, add expense. Our parameters will include request body annotation, type expense, and variable new expense. So request body basically means that our post is expected to have a body like name, category, right, and etc. Whatever we define in our model, right? And it's going to return result from our expense service and its method add new expense. And what we're going to actually pass into our service is the new expense that we read from our request. Okay, another one will be delete mapping, route remove expense / dynamic ID. So basically when we're going to say localhost expenses, remove expense /6, it will remove expense with ID 6. We're going to say public string remove expense. Again, here, instead of request body, we're going to use path variable. This is allow our Spring Boot to read from the parameter, from our ID, right? And we're defining it as integer ID. Again, we return expense service, remove expense ID. And the last, our endpoint will be put mapping. Well, we don't really need ID, so I'll keep it without it. So public expense, update expense, request body, expense. So return expense service, update expense. So basically our controller for expense is ready. Now let's add our income controller to controller folder. So I'm going to name it income controller Java. And basically it's going to look very similar. We're going to define REST controller annotation. We're going to define request mapping annotation, but instead of expense, we're going to type income. So again, instead of interface of expense service, we're going to say income service, update our constructor, income controller, update service. So now we're going to return list of income instead of expenses, and instead of expense service, we're going to basically replace expense service with income. Update income, remove income, and add income source paths. But just minor tweaks here and there, but it should be identical. So updating our methods, replacing expenses everywhere with income, but that's it. Everything else should be the same. Again, remind you about the principle of separation of concerns. One class, one responsibility. This is why we have two controllers, one for expense, one for income. Our next time is adding service layer and repository. So services, we have defined our models and controllers. Now we need to implement the logic that performs the actual actions, calling our databases, handling data transformation and validation, and of course returning the result back to the controller. All of this happens in the service layer. So we're going to create two new packages, interfaces and services. Again, the best practice is one service, one interface. So what is an interface? It's a contract that tells your class which method must be implemented. For example, if an interface defines a create method, then any class implementing that interface must provide that method. So we use interface to achieve abstraction, and they also make testing easier because we can use dynamic type substitution or just mock. So you don't have to use your expense service, you can just use mock expense service, right? Because they still should have its own implementation. So we're starting with interface and call it iExpense service. Our expense interface will define four methods that are going to be implemented by our service class, actual implementation. So we're going to define creating, deleting, updating, and getting methods inside. So first one will be public list expense get all expenses. Remember, because we're already using it in our controller, I'm basically going to repeat them. So public expense add new expense. Again, we pass in our expense type. Removing expense will get a string, and our parameter will be integer ID. And the last one will be update expense with expense data type as a return, and we're passing expense type as a parameter. Same thing for our iIncome service. I'm going to create this one and basically copy paste the same things and changing it. In our income service, we update our return types, our input parameters, right, and service name methods from expense to income. Very similar to what we did in our income controller. Copy paste expense and update everything to income. So let's see the result. We have our iIncome service interface. We're again return list income get all income. We add in a new income that accepts income body, right? We remove income and update income. Same thing for our expense service, list of expenses, add in a new expense, remove an expense, update expense. That's our interfaces. And now we actually go ahead and create implementations for those. So let's go ahead and create a new file in our service folder and name it expense service. Expense service implements iExpense service. So basically we're just saying, hey, we're creating a contract, right? So we're saying that our expense service is committed to fulfill the methods that we defined, right? So create implementations. I'm going to create an annotation named service. It's going to tell our Spring Boot to treat this class as a service. So inside we're going to define a variable, and that will be a variable that will be a reference for our repository. Again, don't worry about it yet. We're just going to deal with it a little bit later. Again, we're going to create our constructor that inject this repository and assign it to our reference. And now the most interesting part, we're going to define our interface methods and give it actual behavior. So let's create public list expense get all expenses. Again, I'm going to create an override annotation for our method. And inside of get all expenses, we're just going to say return repository.find all. So this is probably the most interesting part, because you probably already understood that we do not do any SQL right now. Instead, we're just saying our GPA repository, hey, please use your integrated queries and return me this, right? So find all, it's one of those. You can go ahead and check maybe documentation to see all possible methods can be find all, save, find by ID, and etc, etc. So yeah, just go ahead and check it out. I'm going to leave the link in the description for that. So yes, for our get all expenses, we're going to use method find all. Then for our add new expense, I'm going to use try catch and try return repository safe expense, right? If something goes wrong, we're just going to throw a new runtime exception like can't save expense. Next one, we're going to work with remove expense, right? So basically, we're just going to say, hey, repository, delete by ID, and pass in our ID. If everything's okay, we're just returning the string the expense was removed. Else, again, I'm going to use catch, return could not remove the expense. And the last one will be update expense. So we're going to create optional variable, and we will try to tell our repository find by ID. What is optional, basically, if it exists, we'll get it, otherwise it will be null, right? So this is optional. So we just want to avoid an error. So basically, if current expense is present, we're going to update it. So we're going to create fetched expense and assign it like our current expense that we just got, get. This is how we actually get the entity, right? Because optional, this is not what we're looking for. We need expense type, right? So current expense that get. Now our fetched expense have this reference, and we're going to update it. Fetched expense set name, our current expense that we just passed from our body, we're going to get the name of it, get amount, and get category. So set name, set amount, and set category. And then we're just trying to do return repository and save it, right? If it fails, we're going to catch it and throw new runtime exception with can update expense. And if our current expense is not present, we're going to throw a runtime exception that says the expense does not exist. So this is our service. Again, this is no data validation. There's nothing here. It's like very basic and very simple, but you can add additional validation, add new expense, and for example, say, hey, if amount is less than 0, or if name is equal to this, XYZ. So yeah, you can be very creative and use your imagination for that. So let's just quickly talk about what happened in our code. Again, the service annotation tells our Spring Boot to treat this class as a service and allow it to be injected into our controller. We also added a variable that represents our GPA repository that we're about to create, and this is going to handle actual data operation, like saving, removing, updating records. And we also created 4 methods that our interface required us to define. And as you already guessed, we're going to do the same thing in our income service. We already have our interface for income, and right now we just can go ahead and create a new service. Let me quickly do that. It will be the same idea. It just will be, instead of expenses, will be income. So we're going to copy our data from iIncome service. All this methods going to also copy our repository for expenses and replace it with income. Again, update our repository everywhere, update our constructor, update our methods, repository all, try catch here, again repository return safe, income, same with catch, option error, throw runtime, cannot add our remove income, try catch, this repository, delete by ID, return, this income source was removed. Catch. And I'm going to copy and paste from our update expense, just replace it with income. Optional income, repository can update income, and income does not exist. Looks good. Okay, one more thing. We need to implement our iIncome service. Now it's ready. So as you can see, the logic is very similar to the expense service. So basically they're identical. So we have a service annotation, reference to the income repository, and we implement all the methods defined in the interface. And right now we have the last piece. We have to add GPA repositories. So as I mentioned before, we're not going to write SQL manually. Instead, we will use the magic of ORM, Object Relational Mapping, and let the Java Persistence API handle all the heavy lifting for us. To do that, we will create a special interface annotated with repository. And this annotation tells our Spring Boot that this is the component responsible for handling all database interactions for a specific table. So, if you remember, our tables are defined as entities in the model package, and each model should have its own repository to manage it. Again, separation of concerns. So let's create a new package and name it data. And inside data, I'm going to create two files, one for income, obviously, and another for expenses. So the first one, we're going to start with expenses, and we're going to name it iExpense repository. And that will be very basic one. So inside, as I said, we're going to add annotation repository, and to add the word extends GPA repository. And in our diamond operator, we're going to type expense, comma, integer. So integer, it's a data type of our ID that we defined in our models. As you remember, that's integer. So, and that's basically it. So everything else GPA repository will handle for us. If you want some unique queries, of course you can define that, but everything basic like saving our data, finding the data, find by ID, delete by ID, this is all handled by GPA. We don't need to write a single line of code here. And now let's go ahead and create iIncome repository. It should be very basic as well. So again, we have our annotation repository. Now we have to add GPA repository. And if you see, we have income instead of expense. So we have our last step is actually seeding the data. So right now our database is empty. So no income, no expenses. To fix this, we can add a data SQL file that Spring Boot will automatically load and process, and that will give us some initial data. Since our H2 database does not retain data after shutdown, the persistence is limited, but it's sufficient for now. So let's go ahead and add script to populate our database. So I'm going to find resource folder and add data SQL in it, and I already prepared some data. I'm going just to copy and paste it. It's going to insert into expense and income some values. So right now we have this data, and our last thing to do is actually letting Spring Boot know that it should be processed for running our application. So let's update our application.properties file. Again, I'm just going to copy and paste settings that are already created, but let's quickly look at this. Our Spring application name will be Budgetify. Our database source will be testdb. Driver will be h2 driver, username, password as a password, so they're basic. Again, please be careful. In production, do not expose this, but mine is like, it's a local host, so nothing, no one is going to access that, so I have nothing to worry about. But yeah, make sure to set Spring H2 console enabled false for your production. But yeah, let's just fix everything we have, because you already noticed we have a lot of missing packages, and I import all classes and we will run our application. So expense, replace to income, our services, updating our names, expense repositories. So yeah, everywhere we see red, we're update. Okay, list optional. Yep. I'm moving very fast, that's fine guys, you can slow down if you want, but basically fix everything you see that is red. Okay, looks like no red left, look, everything looks fine, and this is the moment of the truth. We're ready to run the app. But first of all, I'm going to use command mvn clean install. So basically just going to install on dependencies. I just realized I forgot actually to add one dependency in our pom.xml. Let me quickly fix that, and please do the same, otherwise you might have a build error. But now we can try and run our app. And if everything is okay, we're going to run the app. And that will be Maven build command, mvn, sprint-boot, run. So if everything is okay, we're going to visit our localhost 8080/expenses and see our data that we used in our H2 database. Yep, it's here. So we're done with our app. And also want to quickly show you how to use a postman and request other endpoints, because we can really do post, put, and delete in our browser, so we need additional tools. This is how it's going to look like. Postman for HTTP localhost 8080/expenses/add expense, and I already have body for it. It will be spa. And now, after our post, let's go ahead and check it in our browser. Yep, it's there. Well, our backend is done. Next video is going to be React, and we're going to build beautiful front end for it. And if you like the video, please don't hesitate to subscribe and show me some likes and comments. Good luck and happy coding.